Thanks everybody for joining us today. It's 5 o'clock in New York. It's a beautiful day here in the 80s. But wherever you are, we really appreciate you joining myself, Marilyn Minter, and Betty Tompkins will be in conversation this afternoon. This is the fourth in a series of Zoom conversations that are being held on the occasion of White Column's 50th anniversary. The organization was founded in 1970 and originally known as 112 Green Street and changed its name to White Columns in 1980. And the current exhibition at White Columns, if you're in New York, is from our archives, and it looks at the history of what happened here, the partial history, over the past half a century. And for me, that's kind of remarkable that the organization has been around for half a century. And the invitation to Marilyn and Betty to speak is because both Marilyn and Betty had solo exhibitions at White Columns. Marilyn in 1988, which I believe was your first solo exhibition in New York, Marilyn. Yes. And Betty in 1991. And again, I think it was your first solo exhibition in New York, Betty.
I think so too.
Yeah. So that's the context. And obviously, I think both Marilyn and Betty's work shares a lot of commonalities. And this is perhaps best expressed by the current exhibitions they have in Montpellier in France, which opened very recently and run through September, where they have parallel solo survey exhibitions. And there's some really great writing around those exhibitions in both the catalog and the public materials. And I thought, just by way of an introduction, that I just read a very short text from one of the texts that accompanies your exhibitions in France. So I'm going to quote, and it says, "The true value of Marilyn Minter's work, like that of Betty Tompkins, has not, to this day, been fully recognized." The text then describes you both as, and I quote, "pioneers of a feminist realism that is only now finding its place in the historical narratives of the second half of the 20th century." And I really like this sort of idea of the feminist realism, because we might also include figures in the idea of feminist realism, such as artists like Sylvia Slay, or even Alice Neal, amongst many others, whose work has been fully recuperated, rehabilitated, and reassessed in recent years. So maybe that's something that we can come to later in the conversation. Betty currently has a solo show at Gavlak Gallery in Los Angeles, and Marilyn's working towards a solo exhibition in New York next year. I won't go into their biographies too much because I really don't think either artist needs a detailed introduction. But curiously, both of you studied at Syracuse University at different times. Betty graduating as an undergraduate in 1966, and Marilyn as a graduate MFA student in 1972. And Marilyn just told me it was the first time she'd ever seen snow. I think you're from Louisiana, is that correct?
It was Louisiana via Florida, but I had never seen, I talked like this, I had a thick Southern accent, and I had never seen snow, and I had never seen weather below 45 degrees. Right. I had all the wrong clothes.
And we'll come to this later, hopefully, as well, but also in the context of the 50th anniversary exhibition. Marilyn has been a very long time board member of White Columns, an extraordinary advocate for the organization and supporter, predating my time at the organization. And,
I actually called to hire you. Not because I knew who you were. Jerry Saltz told me to hire you.
Oh, there you go.
Do you remember?
Oh, mystery solved.
Yeah.
So by way of an introduction and a way of beginning a conversation, and I hope this afternoon is really a conversation, and I'll keep out of the way. I thought it might be interesting just for the viewers who weren't able to see your shows at White Columns, that includes myself, to ask each of you just to describe the exhibitions you had here. And I think one of the things we've discovered when we've been going through the archives for the anniversary exhibition is that there often isn't a lot of documentation of individual exhibitions. An exhibition might be represented by 2, 3, 4, or a handful of images at most. Some exhibitions don't even have that. But we're fortunate in both of these cases to have images of your shows, and we'll begin with Betty. So Betty, I'm going to have 3 images of yours on the screen, but I'll ask each of you the same thing. Could you just say something about the circumstances of your exhibition at White Columns, and perhaps say something about how you saw the art world at that time. Betsy, your show was here in 1991.
Right.
The art world, like the economy, had crashed around 89, 90 with the economic market crash.
It really didn't affect me because I really wasn't part of the art world. Nobody really wanted to show me. And people that I managed to convince to show me didn't sell me. So I had made some sales, which were all out of my studio because I had zero gallery representation. And so this was a very big deal to me to have this solo show. And except for the 3 tools that are on the screen now, all the paintings that you see or will see, I painted for this exhibition.
And how did you make contact with Bill Arning, who was the director at the time?
Yes, I know. I don't actually remember. I went to a lot of shows here and I was friendly and I just started to talk to him and I invited him to my studio and he came a couple of times to my studio and then he said that he wanted to give me one of the project rooms, which I had probably directly asked for because the main room at White Columns was always a curated exhibition and it didn't seem like I was ever going to be in one. So I was very happy to get, and probably I pushed for a solo show in one of the white rooms. It was really great. And when I came to hang the show, all of the paintings that are in it, I had only ever seen leaning against a wall in my studio. I had never seen them off the ground. So we hung them quite low because that's how I was used to seeing them. And Bill came in and he shook his head and he said, "Oh no, you have to raise these, Betty. The paintings are joining with the floor and we need them to be on the wall." And he explained it to me and I did not in fact raise them as high as he had suggested, but I raised them enough that the floor was a separate plane. And then he was quite happy with it. And so was I. And he was right. You know, not having had a lot of exhibitions, I didn't have experience with laying things out or hanging them or anything like else. So it was a real learning experience for me.
And Betty, can you describe the paintings that we're looking at? Were they part of a series that you'd been working on through the previous number of years, or were they a departure?
Yes, I worked on the series, which combined natural elements, natural landscapes with ancient Greek and Roman sculptures. And the idea for me was to see if I could combine them in a way that it made any sense at all, because the landscapes were all pretty current, you know, and the statues were really old. And the one here with the lion in it, that room is actually in the lobby of the Met Museum. And I had been there, somebody told me about it, and I went to see it, and I took a lot of photos, and I brought a catalog so I would have a good photo of it. And I added the lion, and of course the statue, whose entire body from the waist up had been chopped off at some point, was a natural to fit in with the lion. So it told a narrative. And I did want the paintings to tell a story of some sort, that when you looked at it, you would try and figure out what it means. I wish I could remember the titles of them. The one here with the Cupid, I got very big on Cupids, and I think the title of this one is Cupid Stupid, because that's a bird of prey, and here's a Cupid being very innocent, holding himself up to the bird of prey. And what's the third one? Is there a third slide? There was, just past it. There we go. And this is another one of the Cupids, and with a gibbon, I think it is a great ape, chimpanzee, one of those. And the garden, of course, could never have existed on its own. That's a purely cultivated, not natural garden, you know, but I used it anyway. I liked the colors. So I used it, and I had a lot of garden books. So when I had gardens in the painting, they were somebody's garden.
Can I ask you a question, Betty? Were people at the time, when you did this show in 1991, were some of the audience, White Columns, were they aware of the fuck paintings that you'd been making in the late 60s and early 70s?
No, I had not shown them since the early 70s. And if anybody there knew them, they would have themselves become by that time quite elderly to have known it. They just didn't know about it. You know, I really like, and still do it, I like to exhibit. And so I did the fuck paintings for myself and the cow cunt paintings. They were rejected universally by the art world, by dealers and curators. I wasn't hiding them, but after a certain amount of time, I needed the space in my studio, and I took them off the stretchers and I put them on a big roll, which I did very, very, very carefully with a sheet, cotton sheet in between. So when I unwrapped them in 2001, 2002, they were in pretty good shape. You know, but the people here just didn't know.
At that point, I'm going to move forward to Marilyn's, then hopefully bring you both back in together to talk about this time in New York, and we can discuss the individual shows further. We'll look at some of the images of Marilyn's exhibition of White Columns. Marilyn, your show took place in 1989, across Christmas, as you can see here.
Right.
And as far as I understand, it was your first solo exhibition, but you'd exhibited quite extensively before this as a part of a collaborative team.
Yes, with Christoph Kohlhofer. I wanted you to notice Michael Jenkins.
Yeah.
He's the director.
Yeah, from Sycamore Jenkins had a solo show in one of the White Rooms, one of the similar spaces that Betty had shown it.
He was really talented. And remember we did that early work show? It was because of his work that I remembered what it was.
Yeah, what Marilyn's referring to is about 10 years ago at White Columns, we organized an exhibition of artwork by art dealers who actually began and trained as and exhibited as artists. Michael Jenkins wasn't in the show,
but he was
part of the inspiration
to do it, and he chickened out at the last minute. Yeah. So he didn't get to work, and he got scared and said, "I can't do it."
I have some images now, Marilyn, of your show from 1988, and at this time, White Columns was at 325 Spring Street, and I forgot to mention that when Betty, you had your show, that the gallery was at Christopher Street. Bill Arning was the director on both occasions, I think. So he was the director who invited you, I assume, and helped you organize the shows. But Marilyn, maybe you could talk us through your show. And in '88, I would imagine that the New York art world was kind of red hot.
It was the first body of work that I did after I got out of the collaboration team, and I had to use something other than oil paint. So that's where I started working with enamel. So it was all about learning how to use enamel. I was just learning how, and I literally, everything's hand painted. And I used Velux. I took these images of housework, basically, and turned them into dot screens, and I painted with the projector on. These are all 3 paintings, yeah, that were in the show. That's interesting. I haven't seen them since you showed me these. I didn't even know you had these slides. But they're all done on metal. I was actually learning how to paint, and Bill came to my studio. Yeah, there they are. Bill came to my studio and didn't say a word. And he was at that point going to 1,000 studios a year. And I thought he hated everything. And then he called me a week later and he bought a painting and he offered me a show. And he didn't hint that he was even interested. And I asked him, I said, God, I thought you hated everything. And he said, because he had to see so much work, he had to be stone faced, you know, when he was in everybody's studio. You have to do that too, don't you, Matthew?
Not as much.
Not as much. Nobody thought that. No one could go to 1,000 shows a year. But Bill did it. He was encyclopedic.
Yeah.
I think the dynamics of that have also changed a lot with the, you know, the rise of social media and so forth in the past 20 years.
Yeah. I ended up taking 3 of these images and making my first print silk screens. Yeah. But this is like the body of work where it was worth me learning how to work with enamel paint. And it's interesting, it was images that already existed in the culture. At this point, I wasn't even shooting my own images. And I just let the enamel drip. I wasn't making it drip. I just let it drip. And then I painted the dots on top of it.
Yeah, we have
nothing like I'm doing now.
You mentioned at the top of what, just when you were speaking, Marilyn, that you had to find another medium apart from oil paint. Why was that?
Well, I didn't want it to, you know, I didn't want the work to look like what I did with the collaboration team. Because I was showing with Chris Kohlhofer in Gracie Mansion in the bad old days in the East Village. It was, you know, it was a pretty crazy time. And I had to make, this is the only way I could figure out how to make my paintings not look like our collaborations. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. I just didn't want it to look like a collaboration. So I could work with enamel, and I worked with a projector on, and I turned them into dots, and it didn't look like anything like we had done together. That's really my only reason to go to enamel paint. But once I started working with it, I never stopped.
And I was curious about, you know, Bill's role as the director and the chief curator of White Comms. Was he very heavily involved with both of you or either of you in terms of selecting the show, or once he'd made the invitation, was it a quite hands-off process and that you really decided what would be in the show? And obviously in Betty, he made some suggestions about the installation.
He didn't do, I think he just said, do whatever you want.
Yes, that's my recollection also. You know, and then when I got the paintings into the room and he saw them for the first time, he gave me a big smile. So I knew he liked them. I hung them too low.
Can you both say something about, you know, the audience at that time? Because, you know, I think that, you know, the social dynamics of the art world have changed considerably.
Yes, because of social media.
And, you know, just the way that we encounter art's changed significantly. But I was curious about, you know, between 88 and 91, a lot of things changed in the economy in New York, in the art world itself. The careers that had blossomed in the 1980s faded away. And both of you in different ways, quite different ways, I think, were starting out in a sense. That you are both making first solo shows in New York, but both of you had been making work for more than a decade prior. And in, you know, Marilyn's case, you'd exhibited, but under different circumstances. So I was curious about the audience for your exhibitions and then the kind of reception that you got at the time.
Well, I got a review in the Times from Roberta Smith, so that was.
And was that a big deal in 88? Is that?
Back in those days, actually, a good review from Roberta was a real ticket to success. And I actually had 10 different galleries make me an offer.
Directly as a result of the show White Comms.
So yeah, exactly.
I can clearly remember seeing your work in London the following year in 1989 at Nicola Jacobs. So that seems like a very quick.
I had a promising career until I did the hardcore corn. So I had a nascent career, except I sold everything really. And then I did the hardcore corn, and then in 1989 and 92, and then everything stopped dead. And I had to crawl my way back up the ladder.
Who was the actual audience for your shows? Was it artist friends? Was it the New York gallery community, critics? I mean,
Well, it's always your artist friends. You know, they're the first ones.
Yeah, friends.
Yes, that's how you know who they are, because they actually show up. And if they can't make the audience, they're there pretty fast after that. So they came. White Columns always had a certain number of collectors coming through, and they had a certain number.
Yeah.
Huh?
Bill actually sold the work. The
Absolutely.
Rebels bought work. You know, people like the Rebels bought out of every show, just like Marty buys.
Not mine, unfortunately.
Well, you were a white room. That's probably why.
Yes. No, I was not a main show. I was a project room. Absolutely.
But this is the same time Katie Nolan was showing, and she was my friend. And I bonded with all of these people. And
yeah, I mean the time frame of both of your shows from 88 to 89 through to 91 was a really extraordinary time at White Columns. A lot of incredible artists had their first shows: Gary Simmons, Fred Wilson, Katie Nolan, Lutz Backer, John Curran, yourselves obviously, and many others. And obviously I wasn't around in New York at that time, but is that partly, do you think, to do with the art world crashing and then the art world sort of starting to reimagine and rethink itself, that opportunities arose for very different kinds of artists?
Yes, I think that is absolutely true, because for many of us, our introduction to new artists is through social media. We see it all online. You don't actually have to go there if you're good at looking at JPEGs and figuring out what the art actually is. If you can train yourself to do that, you're at an advantage. And I think that's one of the major differences between then and now. Then, if you wanted to see a new artist's work, you got off your ass and you got over there. And you went to see the show, and you stayed for as long as it took for you to get a real solid understanding about it. Because there was no JPEGs. There was no social media. It was the only way you could see things.
Slides.
Slides, yes, right.
And I think, Betty, you
I
told me
still
that.
have mine. Do you have yours, Marilyn?
I'm digitally translating them right now into actual.
JPEG.
Yeah, I'm digital. I'm going digital right now.
Yeah, I have periodically tried. I have to just bring somebody in, dump it all on their lap.
Yeah.
And say, have a good time. It'll take you days.
Yeah.
Betty, you told me earlier that your work was actually already in White Columns slide registry, which may have been how White Columns first saw your work.
It's really possible, because it's one of the things that I remembered about White Columns, thinking about it now, is that I did try to get my slides into any registry that I could, in the hopes that somebody would fall over it.
And people used to come in and look at I remember when I was installing, people would come, I mean, literally, Bill was so encyclopedic. Half the galleries in New York showed somebody that got out of White Columns.
Right.
Like Michael Jacobs, Jack Pearson. His first show was, I think, Glenn Ligon, the first time I saw his work was at White Columns.
Yeah, and around the same time.
After Sonnebind was White Column artists.
But one of the things, that's when we were putting together the 50th anniversary exhibition, I think one of the things that's quite noticeable about White Columns history over the years is that the gallery became known for giving a younger emerging artist their first show. But what I think is really interesting about both of you is that when you showed at White Columns in 88 and 91, you'd really both been you'd been making work for at least 10 years, and I think in Betty's case, 20 years plus.
I had been making the work, but I wasn't given much opportunity to show it. And that's a difference. I made work because I was an artist, and that's what artists do. Also, when I was a college student and a graduate student, there was zero expectation that you would leave school and walk into a solo show or group shows at good galleries and get gallery representation. because every artist that I was studying in contemporary art, the youngest they were getting their first shows was in their 40s. So I didn't have that expectation that everybody, of course, now has. And that was a very different time. I didn't expect it. I didn't even know I was supposed to work for it.
I did see youth getting attention. Like Julian Schnabel was I saw him and David Sally right out of art school, sort of getting a lot.
Yes, they were, yeah. I think the first one, the oldest one who was shown right out of art school is Frank Stella. And because I remember a review of his first show. And the fascinating thing was, they kept saying over and over, was that he had just left graduate school. So then all the others after them could be younger.
Yeah, it's actually true. I
Yeah,
don't know if that's true today. I mean, but there were phenoms, you know, that had a lot of attention at the age of 25, but
absolutely.
by the time they were 35, you didn't hear about them anymore.
By the time you both had your respective shows at White Coms, you both had really a significant history of making, if not necessarily a significant history of showing in your case, Betty. But
I didn't show either.
Oh, right.
I showed with the collaboration team, but everyone just assumed he was the force behind the work. I mean, he was a well-known artist already when we started working together. It was at a collab. I don't know if you know anything about that history, but it was a very bad time, you know, in terms of the crack epidemic in the East Village, and people were dying of AIDS, and you know, half the galleries lost their artists because of they died, and it was a really incredible time to come here in '76. There was nobody that didn't get mugged, right, Betty?
Yes, including me. Including me. My first husband and I lived in Columbia University Teacher College graduate housing, and we got mugged on Broadway, and we learned always to carry an umbrella as a weapon. You remember those days?
I do. I remember people carrying mug money, you know, that you gave them that money, not your wallet. Yeah.
And when I first moved to Soho, what we had, you must remember this too, was the Whistle Brigade. So that everybody, if you were outside in the evening, you carried a whistle with you. And if you were inside in the evening, you kept a whistle by your window, so that if somebody felt endangered, they would blow in their whistle, and then everybody would open their windows and whistle back. And whoever was having the bright idea to mug whoever was on the street would get the better idea of just leaving.
Well, I actually got mugged with a gun to my head on Spring and Green. It's hard
wow.
Spring and Green with a gun.
That was my first corner.
Yeah. It's hard to believe, Matthew, nowadays, but it was like there was no place to live for kids to come to New York. But in the 70s, there were plenty of places to live, but it was an automatic that you would get mugged and robbed. We got broken into 3 times.
Oh, yes. My building was broken into also several times.
That there was always some kind of detriment to coming to New York City. Danger in our case, or in Matthew's case, or younger people today, you can't even, you know, now I guess maybe you could move back into Manhattan. I think it might be reversing right now.
If you took a cab home, you know, if you could scrape up the money to take a cab home, the driver would always like look at me, and I was very young looking for my age, and he would say, "I'll wait here till you're inside."
I always wait. You didn't even have to ask them to wait.
No, I never asked, but they would always stay there to make sure.
Anyone who left my house.
We all looked so young. We brought out the paternal in them.
I used to stand on the fire escape with my phone to call 911 to make sure whoever left my house late at night could get to Houston Street.
Well, maybe,
Yes.
the way to segue from that too is that, around the times you had your shows in 88 and 91, what were the circumstances for both of you in terms of your working situation, your studios, but also how did you support yourself in the city at that time?
Well,
I taught high school.
I'm sorry, are you talking, Marilyn? I'll shut up.
No, I just said I taught high school.
Oh, yeah. I taught in a private school for a couple of years, and then I had part-time jobs in the fashion industry. I was perpetually broke. And the only thing the job in the fashion industry got me was access to private sales of very fancy clothes at prices that I could scrape together. So I had a beautiful wardrobe that cost me pennies.
I did start teaching in SVA at 86.
Around that time?
Yeah, I went from teaching high school to SVA, and that's how I survived.
Were studios fairly affordable and accessible? And
absolutely, yeah. I had choices.
Yes, and I lived in mine. They made it even better. No two rents.
Well, you bought yours.
I did buy mine. When I came to New York, and everybody was renting, and everybody was telling me I was a fool to want to purchase. What I saw was, first of all, you had to give the landlord or the managing agent, you had to pay them a fixture fee. And right. A fixture fee was everything that was nailed or bolted down. You had to pay for the toilet. You had to pay for the bathtub. You had to pay for the kitchen sink. You paid literally for everything, no matter what kind of awful condition they were in. And a lot of people I know, they paid the fixture fee and everything immediately broke. So that was that. And then there was also key money that you would have to pay your landlord or the managing agent, and it was thousands of dollars. And it was so that they would give you the key to which you were entitled once you signed the lease. So it was those two factors. And at my first loft that I bought for $5,500, $6,000, and I didn't have to pay any of that.
Right.
It just seemed to me, because I was already old enough to see what effect inflation could take, and the insecurity of living where you don't own. This I didn't have from my own personal experience, but from other people's experience. If somebody else owns the space that is your studio and is your home, you can be out in a minute. You don't ever really have any security, and you also have no guarantee on what it will cost you, even with a lease. So it seemed to me co-ops were just starting, and I think the first one that I bought into, which was on Spring and Green, where Marilyn got mugged, was only the second or third co-op in Soho. And so it was bare space, raw space. It had nothing. And we started from scratch.
Well, maybe this is an interesting point to, pivot the conversation and pick up on something that Marilyn alluded to later. That Marilyn, you said around 89, 1991, when the subject matter of your work changed and you started to make paintings based on pornographic imagery. And obviously, Betty, the work that we now know you for from the late 60s and early 70s, the fuck paintings, which
started in 1969.
Yeah, many of us only saw for the first time in 2002 at Mitchell Algus and since.
That's right.
Obviously, Betty, you've said at the beginning that nobody was interested in showing this work. And then Marilyn, you said later that when you changed the subject matter of your work, their interest in your work changed and then ultimately stopped. So perhaps you could both talk about the difficulties you encountered because of the kind of imagery you were making, but also, I guess, really the kind of art you were interested in seeing.
Marilyn, you want to go first?
Okay. I saw the Mike Kelly show in 90, I think, at Metro. And that's what put me into this category anyway. Because he was working, his work really looked like, you know, you remember the pictures of it, Matthew, of stuffed animal sculptures, stuffed animal paintings.
Love them.
Yeah, candles on a table, all melted, felt banners. And it reminded me of like a 13, 12-year-old girl's bedroom. It was really mall culture. It was almost like the discarded, he had a chest of drawers, decoupaged with eyes and mouths. And it looked like, and then there was a picture of Mike underneath the glass, like a young 13-year-old kid would have. There was actually a sex manual, how to sex, taped underneath. He had a mirror showing this chest of drawers. And I thought, this is really this kind of unicorn mall culture, sort of dismissive. If a woman artist had made that work, nobody would give her the time of day. And that, it really, if you think about it, it's true. And then I thought, well, what subject matter have women never painted, never worked with? And I thought porn, and I didn't know about Betty, of course, but I did know about Judy Bernstein, and I knew about Carol Ann Schneemann. So I thought, well, if I was going to do this, I had to do hardcore porn. So I did Cum Shots, that whole Cum Shot series. And that was, I thought everyone thought like me, that I was, you know, a pro-sex feminist. And I showed it. And actually a critic that we all know came to my studio and said, if you show this, your career is going to be over. And I really thought he was crazy. But he was actually right. And Betty was a pioneer. And I always think, God, Betty had more nerve than any living human. Because, you know, there's now a whole group of artists that I just found out about, like Penny Slinger from Britain, or what's her name, Cosima Tutti, Matthew, British.
Cozy Fanny Tutti.
Yeah, Cozy Fanny Tutti. Yeah, people like that I just learned about. I didn't know they existed. So it was like the whole idea of women owning sexual agency or making the production of it was verboten, you know, and it still is for young, beautiful girls. But as old ladies, we can do anything. Our show in Montpellier, that would never happen in the United States. They could show Betty or they could show me, but they would never show the two of us together.
And
yes, it's an interesting conversation when you see the two shows together. You know, I got my images, I got them from my first husband's porn collection. He had sent away through a P.O. box for these small photographs, because he got them in the early 60s, late 50s. And it was when porn through the US mail was totally illegal and you could be arrested if you were in possession of it. And what he did, this was way before we met, he was living in Everett, Washington, and he went up to Vancouver and rented a P.O. box, sent off his money orders, waited for what he thought was the right amount of time, drove over the border, emptied out the P.O. box, hid the packs of photos in the cushions of his car, and drove back into the United States from Canada, hoping he looked like the all-American boy. And so nobody searched the car. And when I met him, of course, they came with him. And I was looking at them one day and all of a sudden, I looked at this one photo and I said, you know, if you take this out and this out and this out and this out, you have what I have been looking for since I got to New York, which is you have an image that is full of charge, and is also abstractly gorgeous, because I was trained originally as an abstract expressionist. So the first thing that I see when I look at anything is, how is this thing put together abstractly in terms of abstract terms? And then I started ripping up little pieces of paper and blocking out the area that I wanted to do. And I said, this is what I've been looking for. If I saw a painting of this, I would stand there and look at it, because it was driving me crazy. The art world in Manhattan was so small, you could see it all in one Saturday afternoon. And I was consistently seeing shows that I liked at Sidney Janis Gallery, Castelli Gallery, Sam Coote's Gallery, a couple of other places. And the rest of it, after a while, I just couldn't go in there, because I would go in, spin around, and I would leave, because there was nothing that would grab my attention. And what's the point of spending your life doing things that bored you? I just couldn't see it. So I was really searching for it, and that's how I found it.
When you started making those paintings, Betty, I mean, did other people see them? I mean, outside of your immediate circle, did you have an opportunity to show any of them in that time?
No. In 1973, I had my first real opportunity, which was to show them at a gallery in London. I think it was London. Paris, no, Paris. I don't know. And it was a show on new realism and hyperrealism. I was still in my 20s. I was like 26, 27 when I was curated into the show. And it was France. They came and picked up the pieces and sent it off in a crate, and it was centered as soon as it hit the ground in France. That was it. And it took, since there was no email and long distance phone calls cost a fortune then. Now they cost you like a dime, but then it was really an expense you would think about. So most of the correspondence over the show was done through letters, snail mail. And so it would take weeks to write and a letter to get there, and then weeks to get the reply back. So it took a long time to resolve.
But there's some poetic justice that your current museum survey of these paintings is taking place in France.
Oh, don't I know it?
40 years later.
Don't I know it? I just love it. Eventually, Center Pompidou wanted to buy one, and they wanted to buy an early one, and they wanted it to have been a censored one. And so they bought Fuck Painting #1.
They had the first Fuck painting.
Huh?
They bought the first Fuck painting. Fuck painting #1.
Yes, the first one, because it was censored. #1 and #5 were censored in France. So yes, and I went to that opening, Marilyn.
And Marilyn, when you showed the paintings based on pornographic imagery, as the critic who visited your studio, and it turns out he was correct that it was going to temporarily, albeit, end your career. I mean, how do you absorb that as an artist?
Well, people think that, I gave no fucks about it, but it's not true at all. I was devastated. Here I was, doing clinic defense and being called a traitor to feminism. So it was a shock. I just thought everyone thought like I did. And it was like a time where I was really making images that I thought were, women, it was time for women to make sexual imagery for their own amusement and pleasure, which I still believe. And this was, the first time I ever saw political correctness. And we're seeing it now also, but this was, I think it comes in waves, comes and goes, and there's always a backlash. But the internet didn't exist. So when Betty and I were making any sexual imagery, you know, our audience was a bunch of people that were artists and writers who, you know, I mean, to get sexual imagery, you literally had to go to 42nd Street, you know, which I did do to get the images. And I was the only, I mean, I walked into a store and I walked down an aisle and everybody scattered. I mean, it was like, guys were terrified.
Really?
To get in there. Yeah.
That's a great story.
Shocked, you know, what's a woman doing in this store? And, or I went down to Wall Street and, you know, I was taking images from an abusive history and repurposing them. And it was just unheard of. People just didn't do that. And I thought it was an only natural thing to do, you know, like I said, if Mike Kelly was a female artist, no one would give him the time of day. And so it was just, it's still like a real verboten thing. We are postmenopausal women. I mean, you know, I always talk about that photo of Louise Bourgeois holding the big dildo that Mapplethorpe shot.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone would think she's adorable. But if she was a 25-year-old girl, it would have been really taken so much, she would have been slut shamed. True?
And Betty, the circumstances for your work of the late 60s are quite different because the work wasn't really seen. So there wasn't like a backlash against the work, but you stopped making the work.
Well, yes, I did manage to get some dealers over. You know, I was young and I was cute and I was persistent. And so some people did come over, but the rejection was universal. And they all hoped I would just lose interest and move on to something else.
And in 2002, you know, when a wider audience had a chance to see these works for the first time, I think the first time I saw them was at Mitchell Algus's gallery. So
yes, that was my first gallery show.
Yeah.
With those works on purpose. And it was really fascinating to watch the reaction. And I thought that I had possibly lasted into an age where they could be more accepted.
Because I mean, when the show at Mitchell's happened, it was 30 years after you'd made them. And
yep.
From the perspective of us talking today, that was 20 years ago.
Yep.
So it's half a century.
Yep.
And was there, how did it feel to have the work seen and, you know, celebrated?
It felt really wonderful. One of the writers for the New York Times, not Roberta, Holland Cotter, excuse me.
Yep.
Apologies. He was at the gallery when I arrived for the opening, and I was nervous. And I know that when you're nervous, the best thing is to just get on and do whatever that you're nervous about. And then it'll either happen or it'll blow up in your face. But at any rate, you have something to do. And sitting at home waiting for the clock to change numbers was not working for me. So I went and I was about 15, 20 minutes early. And when I walked in, I heard Mitchell talking. There were already a fair number of people in the gallery, as there had been when we were installing. And he turned to me with this huge smile. And Mitchell saying, and here's the artist now. And so he introduced himself and I thanked him for coming. And he gave me this huge smile. And he said, I have to leave now. I'm working on a review. And the next day, one of my good friends, the artist Claudia DeMonte, she calls me up at 7 o'clock in the morning. And she said, Betty, I know it's too early to call 7 in the morning on a Friday, but it's never too early if you're in the New York Times. And I said, I'm in the New York Times? And apparently, Holland Cotter had been writing a review of a feminist show that was at the Parish Museum out in the Hamptons, and then another one I had known about and had tried very hard to get in, and they wouldn't even look at my stuff. and the other one I hadn't heard about it. And in the middle of their review, he started to talk about my work, and he called it formidable. And when I showed the review to my now husband, Bill Mutter, he looked at it and he read through it and he said, Betty, there's only one adjective in this entire review, and it was across the whole page at the top of on top of the fold. So it's a long review. And he said, you're the only one with an adjective attached to yourself, which was amazing.
I think one of the other shows was a show called Gloria, which was at White Columns, curated by Catherine Morris and Ingrid Schaffner. That was in the
No,
no,
I don't think it was. I would have remembered.
That was 2002 as well. I mean, and Marilyn later, when you had a retrospective, a wonderful retrospective at the Brooklyn Museum, where the works that were shunned in the early 90s start to become recuperated within the larger narrative of your whole practice. I mean, is there a kind of vindication in your commitment to those ideas and those images and those works?
I'd like to think so. I like to think, I'm just ahead of my time. That's like the best case scenario, right? Betty was ahead of her time.
No, I never will admit to that. I think you can only be of your time, and that you can be rejected in your time, but you can't be ahead of your time. My today is the same as your today.
But I really think both of our careers are more, it's really typical if you look at art history.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
That I'll cop to.
And it's really rare to see, I'm pretty sure it's pretty rare to see someone who gets that white heat from the art world, like the Julian Schnabels or the Damien Hirst. How do you survive that? Whereas
you just keep working.
We're still hungry. And because nobody gets that white heat, nobody really, maybe a little bit Cindy, that's about it. Maybe a Marina Abramovich, but women artists are constantly marginalized.
Absolutely.
It's maybe a good thing in the sense of that we're always still hungry.
Yes.
And so like if you look at Joan Mitchell or like Helen Frankenthaler, she was so good. And she's going to be recuperated big time very soon. I can see that. I can feel it coming. But I look at those paintings now and they're mind-bogglingly good. And they're just written out of art history practically.
Yes.
It's sort of normal for female artists. Maybe your generation, Matthew, or a generation younger, maybe that's not going to happen anymore. The young artists.
The access to information is so different.
Yeah.
That's what would make.
I can't see anyone.
Carol
Walker. She's not going to disappear for 20 years and then rediscovered again. So I think it has changed for female artists. I definitely
hope so. I have a text from Bill Arning who says that
right now?
Styles, yes, right now.
Live.
Stephen Styles from Sensory Evolution introduced him to my work. The mystery is solved.
I remember Stephen Styles. See, now Bill would remember that.
Well, we're about to come to the end of our time on this Zoom broadcast. So obviously I want to thank you both for taking the time to do this. And
thank you, Matthew.
Really encourage anyone that happens to be in Europe to stop by Montpellier to see your parallel solo exhibitions. It's a great shame that we won't get a chance to see your work side by side so that we can think about it simultaneously as we could have done in France. And we wish you both the best for the summer. So thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Betty, and thanks, Marilyn. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Matthew, and thank you, Marilyn. A pleasure as always.
Always.
Okay, goodbye, everyone.
Bye, guys.